I never thought a flight from New York to Miami would change my life. But I guess that's what happens when you find yourself sitting next to a woman who thinks she's the queen of the skis, Karen, the self-proclaimed, most important person on this plane. And trust me, when you're as good at blending in as I am, you tend to notice people like that from a mile away. Let me give you some background. My job is simple, really. I'm an air marshal. You've probably heard of us. Those people who sit quietly, mostly unnoticed, in plain clothes, ready to jump into action if anything goes south. You'd never guess I was one, not unless you really knew what to look for. I don't wear a badge around my neck or anything flashy. I just sit there, minding my business, hoping the flight will be smooth. So there I was on this particular flight looking for nothing but some peace and quiet. I was traveling from New York to Miami to get some downtime, finally. First-class seat. Yeah, I'd gotten lucky with an upgrade. I'm not some rich guy trying to show off. It's just that sometimes when you have a few extra miles and a well-timed booking, you end up in first class. The whole thing is pretty chill, plenty of legroom, some decent food, and the occasional glass of wine. It's a nice break from the usual cramped economy seats. But then she showed up. Her name was Karen, not that I knew it at first, but Karen is the kind of person who just oozes entitlement. You don't need to ask her name to know exactly who she is. The moment she stepped onto the plane, I could feel the change in the air. She sauntered down the aisle like she owned the place, dressed in some overpriced designer outfit, a purse so big I'm pretty sure she could fit a small child in it. She had that look, the one where she glances around like she's constantly judging everyone. And when she passed by my seat, I swear she practically sneered at me. Maybe it was because I didn't look like the type who belongs in first class. Who knows? She was loud, very loud, and as soon as she made her way to her own seat, I heard her voice rise over the usual pre-flight chatter. Honestly, I don't even know why they let people like that sit in first class, she said, loud enough for me to hear from a row away. I raised an eyebrow. At first, I wasn't sure if she was talking about me or someone else. But then, I saw her looking straight at me, eyeing me from head to toe with that look of judgment that only people like her can pull off. People who have never known a struggle in their lives, who feel entitled to everything around them. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm, not wanting to draw attention just yet. She gave me a fake, sugar-coated smile. "Oh, I was just saying that, people like you don't exactly seem to belong up here in first class, do you?" She waved her hand around dismissively, like it was some grand gesture. "It's just not the same. I kept my face neutral, but something in me started to boil. People like me? What was that supposed to mean? What was she even talking about? I forced a smile and said nothing. I knew better than to get into a confrontation with someone like her. Let her have her moment of superiority if it made her feel better. I wasn't going to let her rattle me. But deep down, I was already plotting how I would make her regret thinking she could talk to me like that. The flight attendants came by, offering drinks, and I ordered a glass of wine. I needed to relax. I didn't want to get involved with Karen, but she had this way of drawing attention to herself that made it impossible to ignore her. The moment the drinks were handed out, she did it again. "Excuse me," she called out to the flight attendant, her voice dripping with condescension. "I specifically asked for a window seat, not this nonsense. I'm a paying customer. I deserve the best. Can you do something about this?" She looked at the attendant like she was some sort of servant. I could feel the tension building around her. People were starting to glance her way, clearly uncomfortable with her attitude. But Karen was too busy acting like the center of the universe to notice. The flight attendants, as polite as they were, didn't seem to know how to handle her. They apologized, of course, and promised to see what they could do, but Karen wasn't having any of it. "She's not even going to do anything about it, is she?" Karen muttered loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Honestly, this is ridiculous. I don't know why they let people like that run this plane." I felt the corners of my mouth twitch. Here we go again, people like that. What exactly did she mean by that? I wasn't even sure anymore if I wanted to know. But it didn't stop there. As the flight progressed, Karen began to drop hints that she thought I was the problem. The whole flight. Her attitude seemed to get worse by the minute, and she continued making disparaging comments about the passengers around her. Finally, I couldn't take it any longer. I turned to her and said, "I think you might be mistaken. Not everyone here is as bad as you make them out to be." Her eyes narrowed. "Oh, really?" she replied, her voice rising. "You think you're someone special just because you got a seat in first class? That doesn't mean you belong here, sweetheart. Some of us have standards." I raised an eyebrow. You don't know anything about me, I said, leaning in a little, keeping my voice calm. But it's cute that you think you do. The words hung in the air between us. She looked at me as though I'd just insulted her in front of her entire kingdom. Her face flushed, but instead of backing down, she huffed and turned away, muttering to herself. I could have let it go right then, but something told me she wasn't done yet. There was that look in her eyes, the kind of look that said, I'm going to make this your problem now. And sure enough, as soon as the captain announced that we'd be cruising at 30,000 feet, Karen went into full Karen mode. She slammed her tray table down and waved her hand in the air, calling over a flight attendant like she was royalty summoning a servant. I demand to speak to the manager, she barked. This person is not fit to be sitting in first class. There must be some mistake. I've been coming here for years and this never happens. People like this shouldn't be here. I want a refund. I watched the flight attendants exchange nervous glances. Poor guys. They had no idea how to deal with someone like Karen. They had no idea they were standing just a few feet away from someone who could end this little charade in a second. But I wasn't going to be the one to do it. Not yet. I stayed in my seat, leaning back, sipping my wine. If she wanted to play this game, fine, I could play along. Because Karen was about to find out just how wrong she was about me, and about the world she thought she ruled. The flight was still hours away, and this was far from over. It didn't take long for Karen to escalate things further. Honestly, I should have expected it. Once someone like her gets a taste of what they think is power, they don't know when to stop. But I wasn't about to let her get under my skin. By the time we were cruising at a comfortable altitude, Karen had officially entered full Karen mode. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd settle down after her little tantrum about the seating arrangement. But no, she was just getting started. The flight attendants were walking around, handing out snacks and drinks, but Karen wasn't having any of it. She raised her hand, the one with the perfectly manicured nails, like she was a school teacher calling on a student. The poor flight attendant, a young woman with a look of concern in her eyes, hesitated for a moment before approaching. Yes, ma'am, she asked, her voice gentle. I don't want any of these snacks. I'm on a diet. I'll have a proper meal, Karen declared, as if she were ordering from a five-star restaurant and not a snack tray that was probably the best we were going to get at 30,000 feet. The flight attendant, still smiling like it was her job to remain polite, nodded and said, I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is all we have for now. We'll be serving lunch later. Lunch, Karen scoffed, her voice rising. Are you seriously telling me that this is all I get? How dare you treat me like this? At this point, I was trying not to laugh, but I couldn't help it. Karen's complaints were so over the top that it felt like I was watching a bad comedy sketch. She was leaning back in her seat like she'd just been wronged in the most terrible way. I guess for her, being in first class wasn't enough. She expected the world to revolve around her. The flight attendant, bless her heart, didn't back down. I'm really sorry, ma'am, but we're just following the standard service. There's nothing more I can do right now. You'll have a full meal shortly. But Karen wasn't done. Oh no, not by a long shot. She raised her voice even louder, making sure that everyone on the plane knew how terribly she was being treated. This is unbelievable. I'm paying for a first-class seat and I get this. Are you seriously telling me that people like him? She pointed at me, of course. Get better service than I do. What is wrong with this airline? You people have no idea how to run a business. I had half a mind to just keep quiet and let the scene unfold. But the way she kept referring to me as him, like I was some sort of outsider who didn't belong, was starting to get on my nerves. I looked over at the flight attendants, who were clearly struggling to figure out how to deal with Karen. They were doing their best to keep things calm, but it was obvious they had no idea how to handle someone like her. She was too loud, too entitled, and it seemed like she was just waiting for an excuse to start a scene. And then she gave it to me. You know, Karen said, turning to me with a sweet smile that was anything but sweet. Maybe you should go sit in the back where you belong. People like you don't belong in first class. There's no reason you should be up here. The words hit me like a slap to the face, and for a moment I froze. People like me? I repeated, trying to keep my cool. Yeah, you know, she said with a dismissive wave. People who are, well, you know, proper, people who don't have class. You don't look like you belong here. It's kind of embarrassing, honestly. I could feel my heart rate picking up. She had crossed a line now. My first instinct was to jump in, let her know exactly who I was, but I stayed calm. It wasn't time yet. She needed to go deeper into this hole of her own making, so I smiled, a tight, polite smile. "Well, Karen," I said, forcing the words out with a hint of sarcasm, "I'm sure you've got such a good eye for who belongs in first class and who doesn't." Her face tightened. "How dare you talk to me like that? I'm a paying customer, and you're just some random guy who lucked into a seat up here." "Actually," I said, leaning back in my seat, "I'm sure you're right. I'm just a guy who got a lucky upgrade, but you know what? You might be onto something. Maybe I should sit in the back, right next to someone who has more class than I do." Karen blinked, clearly caught off guard by my calm demeanor. She expected me to blow up or at least to cower under her judgment. But I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction. Not yet. She scoffed and turned away from me, huffing like an annoyed child. "People like you really think they can get away with everything, don't they?" I wasn't sure what she meant by that. Was I supposed to apologize? Maybe she wanted me to admit some flaw about myself that I didn't even care about. But all I did was keep my face neutral and take a sip of my wine. For the next half hour, Karen continued to rant, but now it was more about how she was the one who deserved the best service, how she shouldn't have to put up with inferior people in first class. She went on and on about how disgusting it was that the airline didn't cater to her specific tastes, and how she was thinking about calling her friends at the corporate office to get them fired. I'm sure the entire cabin could hear her. People were trying to ignore her, but it was getting harder and harder. I saw the flight attendants exchanging worried looks from the front of the cabin. They were visibly uncomfortable, unsure of how to handle her at this point. Karen was getting louder and more dramatic by the minute. I almost felt bad for them. Almost. Finally, the flight attendant came back to check on her, this time with more authority. She tried to calm Karen down, but Karen wouldn't have any of it. "This is outrageous. I am not putting up with this," she yelled. I could feel the frustration building inside me. People like Karen always thought they could get away with anything, just because they could throw their weight around and make a scene. But what they didn't know was that they were about to mess with the wrong person. The flight attendant, still trying to stay professional, asked if Karen needed any further assistance. But Karen, as if on cue, decided to make her next move. "I demand to see the captain," she barked. "Now, I want to speak to someone who knows how to run an airline." And that's when I finally had enough. I leaned forward in my seat and tapped her shoulder. She turned to me, her expression surprised. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I think you might have forgotten something. I think you might have forgotten who you're talking to." She narrowed her eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" I smiled. "You're right. I'm just some guy who got an upgrade. But what if I told you that your little tirade wasn't going unnoticed?" Karen blinked. "What are you talking about?" "Oh," I said, sitting back again, "just a little something. Let's call it authority. You see, I'm not just some guy. I happen to have a very important job that makes me, well, someone you don't want to cross." Her eyes went wide. The color drained from her face. But before she could say anything else, I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the moment. "Maybe it's time for you to stop talking," I said softly, "before you get yourself into more trouble." And as I sat there, I watched her face go from confusion to realization. She was beginning to put the pieces together. And trust me, I was about to make sure she remembered this lesson for the rest of her life. There's a feeling you get when you know you're sitting on the edge of something big, something that's about to explode. That's exactly what I felt when I watched Karen's face slowly change from confusion to panic. You'd think someone like her would know better than to mess with people like me. But then again, people like Karen are used to walking all over everyone they meet, especially if they think they're untouchable. I could see her processing it, my words sinking in slowly but surely. She'd been calling me just some random guy up until now, but I wasn't that anymore. She was starting to realize that she had made a mistake. And here's the thing, I could have dropped the bomb right then and there. I could have told her that I was an air marshal, that I was trained to handle situations like this. But I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of thinking she could bully me into revealing my hand. No, I needed her to stew in that uncertainty for a while longer. I needed her to feel the fear of not knowing exactly who she was messing with. It was almost cruel, I admit, but Karen had earned it. I leaned back in my seat, crossing my arms and watching her. I wanted to see how far she'd go before she realized she was in way over her head. And judging by the look on her face, she was starting to panic. She opened her mouth like she was about to say something, probably to ask if I was really an air marshal. But then she seemed to stop herself, as if she wasn't quite sure she wanted to know. She glanced around the cabin, trying to gauge whether anyone had heard me, but the other passengers were pretending not to notice, too busy with their own conversations or phones. Her eyes darted between me and the flight attendants, her fingers twitching like she was ready to spring into another tirade. But she didn't, at least not right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, probably trying to regain some of the control she thought she had. It was kind of sad, really, watching someone so full of themselves have their whole world shaken up by a single sentence. But hey, when you pick a fight with the wrong person, that's what happens. So, Karen finally said, her voice laced with uncertainty, "What exactly do you do, huh? Are you some kind of cop?" I raised an eyebrow, giving her a slow, deliberate smile. Something like that. She leaned forward, trying to hide the panic behind her forced, smug expression. "Well, I don't know about you, but I don't appreciate being threatened," she said, her voice shaking just a bit. I held up my hands, palms facing her. "I'm not threatening you, Karen," I said, a little louder than necessary so the other passengers could hear. "I'm just letting you know that what you're doing, how you're treating everyone isn't going to fly, and trust me, I'm the last person you want to cross." She scoffed, but the sound was weaker than before. "Oh, please, like I'm supposed to be scared of you?" She leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms, but the way she kept glancing at me told a different story. "Whatever you are, you can't intimidate me." I almost laughed. She was still trying to save face, but it was clear she wasn't as confident as she'd been earlier. I could see it in the twitch of her lips, the nervous tapping of her fingers on the armrest. "You really think I'm trying to intimidate you?" I asked, my tone a little more casual than before. "No, Karen, I don't need to intimidate you. All I need to do is sit here and let you dig yourself into a hole deep enough that you can't crawl out of." Her eyes narrowed. "You're going to regret this," she hissed. The flight attendant, who had been standing nearby, must have noticed the tension in the air. She walked up to us, still looking like she wasn't sure what to do, but too polite to ignore the situation any longer. "Is everything all right here, folks?" she asked, her voice tentative. Karen immediately shifted into her "I'm the customer" mode. "No, everything is not fine," she snapped, glaring at me. This man," she practically spat the word, "is threatening me. I demand you do something about it. This is unacceptable." The flight attendant turned to me, her eyes searching my face for an explanation. I could see the worry on her face. She didn't want to escalate things, but she also didn't want to cause a scene. I could feel the weight of her gaze, and I knew that I had to handle this carefully. After all, it wasn't her fault she was caught in the middle of Karen's meltdown. "I'm not threatening anyone," I said, my voice steady yet firm. "I'm just telling her the truth. She's been making a scene the whole flight, and I'm just reminding her that there are better ways to behave." Karen, of course, wasn't having any of it. "Liar," she spat. "You're just trying to cover up your own incompetence. I don't know who you think you are, but you don't scare me." I gave a small shrug, ignoring the sting of her words. "I'm not here to scare you, Karen, but I'd suggest you stop digging yourself into a hole. It's going to be a lot harder to get out of when you've made everyone on this plane uncomfortable." At this point, Karen was visibly shaking. She didn't know what to do next. She couldn't go on berating me because she knew that she was just making herself look worse, but she wasn't about to back down either. She sat there for a few moments, her face turning red as she tried to compose herself. Then she did something unexpected. She turned to the flight attendants and gave them an ultimatum. "I want this man removed from my sight," Karen demanded, her voice trembling with rage. "He's clearly unstable and I feel unsafe sitting next to him. He's threatening me and I won't tolerate it." I almost couldn't believe my ears. She was accusing me of being unstable. After everything she'd said and done, I could feel my pulse quicken. I wasn't a violent man, but I could see where this was going. She was going to turn this into a full-on scene. The flight attendants, not knowing how to handle it, began exchanging glances. One of them stepped forward, trying to be the voice of reason. "Ma'am, we're just doing our best to make sure everyone is comfortable," she said, her voice soft but firm. "If you're not happy with your seat, I'll be happy to try and move you, but we can't remove someone just because of a disagreement." Karen didn't like that answer, of course. She snapped back. "Oh, so now you're taking his side? This is ridiculous. You people are all the same, completely useless." But I could see the flight attendants backing away, sensing that this wasn't just a simple disagreement anymore. They didn't want to get involved in a potential confrontation. And that was exactly what Karen wanted. She wanted to make me the bad guy. She wanted to turn the tables so that everyone would see her as the victim. The longer this went on, the more I realized something. Karen wasn't just a rude, entitled passenger. She was a master manipulator, someone who used her loud voice and obnoxious attitude to control every situation. She thought she could bully her way through this flight, just like she had probably bullied her way through every other part of her life. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. The flight attendants hesitated, but they weren't about to remove me, at least not without a serious reason. And that was when I decided to drop the truth on Karen. It wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was about making sure she knew exactly who she was messing with. I leaned forward again, this time so close that she could see the calm in my eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, Karen," I said, keeping my voice low. "And you might want to think twice about what you're doing here. I'm not just some guy you can push around. I'm the guy who makes sure this flight stays safe, so you can keep yelling or you can sit quietly and enjoy the rest of the ride. Your choice." For a moment, Karen didn't say anything. She just stared at me, her mouth slightly open, like she was trying to process the words. The realization finally hit her, and she recoiled, her face draining of color. But it was too late. She had already made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. For a brief moment, everything was silent. I could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen sat there, frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. It was almost laughable how quickly her bravado crumbled when she realized who I was. But I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me smug about it. That wasn't the point. This wasn't a game of me one-upping her. No, this was about putting her in her place and making sure she never forgot how wrong she was. The flight attendant lingered for a moment, her eyes shifting between Karen and me. She seemed uncertain about what to do next, her professional smile slipping just a little. I could see her processing the situation, probably wondering if she should get the captain involved, or just let this mess sort itself out. I don't blame her. This wasn't exactly the usual in-flight drama. But what Karen didn't know was that I'd been watching this situation unfold from the moment she stepped on board. I knew how this was going to play out. Finally, Karen broke the silence, but it wasn't with a confession or an apology. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, she tried to save face, doing what Karens do best, distracting everyone with more noise. "Oh, please," she scoffed, shaking her head dramatically. "So now you're playing the hero, some kind of big shot? I don't care who you think you are, you can't intimidate me. You're nothing. You just want to get a rise out of me, don't you?" Her voice was shaking, but she was still trying to sound tough, like a defiant child. I stayed silent, giving her the space to keep digging herself into a hole. Let her say whatever she wanted. The more she ran her mouth, the clearer it became how little she understood what she was dealing with. "I'm just so sick of people like you thinking they can do whatever they want," she continued, this time directing her words at the flight attendants. "It's disgusting. First class is supposed to be for people who matter, who deserve it, not for him." She gave me a pointed look, trying to dismiss me as irrelevant, but her eyes betrayed her. She knew she wasn't in control anymore. I couldn't hold back a small, sarcastic chuckle. "People like me, huh?" I asked, making sure my voice was loud enough for everyone around to hear. "And just who exactly are people like me, Karen?" The words stung more than I expected, but I wasn't going to back down. I was done playing nice. I was done letting her think she could rule the world from her overpriced seat in first class. I was done letting her spread her hate and venom with every word she spoke. Karen rolled her eyes, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Oh, don't play dumb," she said, waving her hand in the air like I was an annoying fly she was trying to swat. "People who aren't worth it, people who pretend to be important." Her words were like a slap to the face, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't afford to. This was about more than her insults. It was about teaching her a lesson in humility, and it was a lesson she was about to learn the hard way. "You really don't get it, do you?" I said, my voice steady, almost calm. "You walk around thinking you can control everyone around you just because you think you're better than them. You don't even know the first thing about who I am. But you're so quick to judge, so eager to look down on people. You don't deserve a seat in first class, Karen. Not because of your money or your status, but because of the way you treat people." I could see her face redden as the weight of my words sank in. She opened her mouth, probably ready to shoot back with some clever response, but I wasn't finished. Not yet. "You've been acting like the world revolves around you, but it doesn't. People don't have to put up with you. I don't have to put up with you." My words were like daggers, sharp and precise. I wasn't yelling, wasn't screaming. I was simply stating the truth. At that moment, the flight attendant finally stepped in, her voice a little firmer than before. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down. You're disrupting the entire cabin with this behavior." Karen looked like she wanted to fight back to argue to keep making a scene. But she paused, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. For a brief second, it looked like she was finally realizing that no one was on her side. That maybe, just maybe, her antics had gone too far. I could see the wheels turning in her mind as she tried to salvage whatever dignity she had left. And then, bam, she flipped the switch. Like a switch had been flipped in her head, she suddenly turned on the charm, her tone shifting dramatically from enraged to syrupy sweet. "Well, you know," she said, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace, "I'm just a little upset. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I just feel so uncomfortable, you know? This whole situation is just a lot for me to handle." She pressed a hand to her chest, looking as if she might start crying any second now. I almost gagged. The flight attendants glanced at each other, clearly unsure what to do with her sudden change in tone. But I wasn't fooled. Karen had done this 100 times before, played the innocent, misunderstood victim whenever she didn't get her way. She was trying to manipulate the situation, to turn the tables and make me the bad guy. But I wasn't about to let that happen. Not now, not ever. "Cut the act, Karen," I said, my voice still calm, but firm enough that there was no mistaking the authority behind it. "You don't get to act like the victim now. You've made this whole flight uncomfortable for everyone around you. You are the one who's been causing all this trouble, and now you're trying to turn it around so you can play the poor, defenseless lady? Not on my watch." Her eyes widened, the sweet act disappearing like smoke, her face twisted with anger again. "How dare you?" "Karen," I interrupted, leaning forward again, my voice low and controlled. "You're not the victim here. You're not the one who deserves any special treatment. You're just someone who thinks the world owes you everything because you're loud and obnoxious. But guess what? That doesn't work on me. It doesn't work on anyone who actually knows what respect means." Her cheeks were flushed, her breathing shallow. She looked like she was about to burst into tears or shout something ridiculous, but she didn't. She sat there, seething, silent for the first time since this whole ordeal started. For a moment, I thought maybe she was going to make some kind of grand exit, storm off, and demand to be escorted off the plane. But no, she just sat there, fuming. The flight attendants were watching her closely now, their gaze no longer filled with sympathy but with a hint of skepticism. Karen was losing her grip, and it was obvious. I could feel the shift in the air, that subtle change that let me know she was no longer in control of the situation. The other passengers were starting to relax, their attention drifting back to their own conversations, their books, their phones. They weren't going to get involved, but I could tell they were all grateful for the fact that someone had finally put Karen in her place. I leaned back in my seat, folding my arms across my chest. "You're done here, Karen. You can keep making a scene if you want, but it's not going to change anything. You've already shown who you are. Now you get to sit in it." For the first time since she stepped on the plane, Karen didn't have a response. She sat there, defeated, glaring at me with all the venom she could muster, but knowing deep down that she had lost. The cabin was still, almost too still, as Karen sat there, her face burning with frustration. You could feel the heat of her anger radiating off of her, but there was nothing she could do about it. The flight attendants were now giving her as much space as possible, trying to walk that fine line between staying professional and making sure this situation didn't turn into a full-blown disaster. I wasn't one to make a scene, not unless I had to. But the longer Karen stayed quiet, the more I realized how much I had her cornered. She was like a dog that had barked at the wrong person, loud, aggressive, and full of hot air, but now completely deflated. She had lost whatever control she thought she had. The tension in the air was palpable. Passengers who had been watching the drama unfold were slowly returning to their own worlds, pretending like nothing had happened. Some of them might have been glad to see someone finally put Karen in her place. Others might have been hoping it would all just blow over. But for Karen, no, she wasn't going to let it go that easily. I could tell by the way her hands fidgeted and the way her eyes darted around the cabin, trying to find something, anything to latch onto. But she was stuck now. She had pushed so hard to be the center of attention, and now all that was left was her sinking deeper into the realization that she had messed with the wrong person. I didn't need to do anything else. I had already planted the seeds. It wasn't about making her look foolish anymore. She was already doing that on her own. It was about letting her realize that she was the one who had made this a mess. She was the one who would be remembered by everyone, not me. And that was where the plan kicked in. Karen had been so focused on trying to intimidate me and getting the attention of the staff that she hadn't even noticed what I had been doing the whole time. While she was running her mouth, I'd been quietly setting up the pieces for my little payback. It wasn't anything dramatic, nothing over the top or flashy. Just a simple little bit of proof, a nudge to remind her of what she'd tried to do and how it would all come crashing down. I casually glanced down at my phone, which was resting on my lap. The entire interaction had been recorded. Every word she had said, every insult she had thrown, the demands, the threats, all of it. The camera app was still open, just waiting for the perfect moment. I had captured everything, and now it was time to put it to use. Of course, I wasn't going to show it to her yet. No, that wouldn't be satisfying enough. She still had a little more digging to do before she realized what I had in store. Karen was still sitting there, her arms crossed tightly in front of her chest, her lips pursed into a thin line. She wasn't going to make the first move. She wouldn't apologize. That was never going to happen. She was the kind of person who would rather go down swinging, even if it meant looking like a fool in the end. I could see her brain working overtime, trying to come up with a new strategy, something that would shift the situation in her favor. But it was too late for that. The game had changed, and now it was my turn to set the rules. "Karen," I said, breaking the silence, keeping my voice calm and even. "You're really making this harder than it needs to be." She shot me a glare but didn't respond. That was fine. She didn't need to. I wasn't looking for a conversation. I was just making sure she knew she wasn't going to win. "I get it," I went on. "You've got a lot of pride. You don't want to admit that maybe you've overdone it a bit. But you've got to know that you're not going to get your way this time." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Please, like I care what you think. I'm not the one who's causing problems here. You are." I raised my hand, signaling for her to stop. "Let me guess. You're going to tell me that I started all of this, right?" I shook my head slowly, pretending to be disappointed. "That's not how it works, Karen. You started it. You can't turn this around. It's your mess, and you're going to have to own it." She clenched her jaw, clearly seething, but I could see her hands trembling. She wasn't as confident as she'd been at the beginning of the flight. No, now she was just trying to maintain whatever little dignity she thought she still had left. The flight attendants returned, this time with a more direct approach. One of them, a guy who had been standing at the front, walked down the aisle and stopped beside Karen's seat. I could tell he had already heard enough of her complaints and was ready to wrap this up. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to ask you to lower your voice and remain calm for the remainder of the flight," he said, his tone firm but polite. "If this continues, we may have to take further action." Karen's face flushed even more if that was possible. "Further action? What do you mean by that?" She was almost hissing now, her voice trembling with frustration. The flight attendant's expression didn't change. "We can ask you to leave the plane when we land, or we can call the authorities if necessary. We don't want things to escalate, but your behavior is affecting other passengers." Now Karen was really panicking. She was trying to keep it together, but the reality was sinking in. No amount of yelling, no amount of pretending she was in control was going to save her now. This was the point where she realized the walls were closing in, and it was also the moment where I decided it was time for the next step. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, casually opening up the video I'd recorded earlier. It wasn't a long video, only a few minutes, but it was enough. Enough to show her for who she really was. Enough to prove that she wasn't the innocent bystander she tried to play. I held the phone in my hand, but I didn't show her the screen right away. No, I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction either. Instead, I simply said, "You know, Karen, I've been recording everything that's happened since the moment you sat down." Her eyes widened and I could see her pulse quicken. She opened her mouth, probably to say something defensive, but I didn't give her the chance. "I have video proof of everything," I continued, speaking slowly so that she could process the weight of my words. "Every insult, every demand, all the threats, and I'm sure the airline would love to see it. I'm sure the authorities would be thrilled too." Karen's face twisted in a way I hadn't seen before. She went from anger to something else, fear. She could tell I wasn't bluffing. She could feel the walls closing in on her and I wasn't about to give her a way out. She took a deep breath, like she was trying to compose herself, but the damage had already been done. She'd pushed too far and there was no taking it back. "You wouldn't," she said quietly, almost like a whisper. "You can't." I gave her a cold smile. I can and I will. You've crossed a line. Now it's time to face the consequences. She looked down, her face pale now, and for a brief moment, I could see the mask slip. The entitled, self-righteous Karen who thought she could do no wrong was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood just how out of control the situation had gotten. I paused for a moment, letting her feel the weight of her own words, her own actions. She had made this mess, and now it was time for her to clean it up. The flight attendants didn't know what to say. They were caught in the middle of a drama that wasn't their fault, but they were clearly relieved that someone was finally taking charge. Well, I said, breaking the silence, this has been fun, but I think it's time for you to reflect on how you treat people. Maybe the next time you board a plane, you'll think twice before messing with someone who's got a little more authority than you realize. I slid my phone back into my pocket, the subtle sound of it locking echoing in the stillness. Karen didn't respond. She just sat there, her head bowed, defeated. She knew the game was over. The tables had turned and she wasn't getting out of this one. And as we finally began our descent, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. I hadn't just put her in her place. I'd made sure she'd never forget who she tried to mess with. It wasn't about revenge. It was about showing her that sometimes justice doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to be right. And that, I thought, was the sweetest payback of all. The plane began its descent, the gentle hum of the engines a calming contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just a few moments ago. The soft whir of the seatbelt sign lighting up was the only sound in the cabin, aside from the occasional cough or shuffle of passengers getting ready to land. But for me, it was the sound of sweet justice. Karen hadn't said a word since I showed her the video. Her face had gone from flushed with anger to pale with fear, and now she just stared at the tray table in front of her, not daring to look anyone in the eye. The swagger she'd had earlier, the one that had allowed her to belittle everyone around her, had evaporated. She was a shell of the person she'd been when she first boarded the plane. But I wasn't done yet. No, this was just the beginning. I watched her for a moment, not sure if I should feel sorry for her or just relish the sweet satisfaction of seeing someone like her finally face the consequences of her actions. There's something oddly satisfying about watching someone who's used to walking over people realize they're not untouchable. Karen was beginning to understand that, though I doubted she fully grasped the lesson. I wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily, though. No, I was going to make sure she understood what she had just done, and I had a perfect way to do it. I could see her fingers twitching, the unease finally catching up with her. The plane was still descending, and she was clearly in a state of nervous anticipation. She had no idea what was coming next. "Karen," I said, my voice low, but still carrying that cool edge I'd perfected. "You know, I wasn't planning on making this worse for you, but I think you've earned a little reminder." She didn't look at me. I could tell she was trying to keep it together, trying to pretend like she didn't hear me. But I wasn't going to let her hide. "I wasn't going to show anyone the video," I continued, watching her body tense as I spoke. "I wasn't even going to make a big deal out of it. I was just going to let you stew in your own mess and move on. But then you went and made it personal." I paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. The other passengers around us were starting to pay attention. Some were pretending to look out the window, while others stole glances at us, clearly curious about what was going to happen next. I could see the flight attendants watching us from the front, unsure whether to intervene or just stay out of it. Karen finally looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fear. She probably thought I was bluffing, who wouldn't write? But she didn't know me. She didn't know how far I was willing to go. "You're not going to show it to anyone?" Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. It almost sounded like a plea, but she was trying to keep the bravado alive. "Oh, I'm not," I said, my tone turning sharper. "You think I'm bluffing? You think I won't take this to the authorities when we land? You've already crossed the line, Karen. You've made the whole plane uncomfortable, you've harassed the staff, and you've made threats. All of that is on tape. Do you really want to risk it?" Her face paled, her lips trembling as she tried to hold her ground. You can't, this is all just." "Just what, Karen?" I interrupted, leaning in slightly, my voice dropping low, cutting through her rambling. "This isn't just anything. This is you making a scene, harassing people, and thinking you can get away with it. And trust me, people like you don't get away with it, not when there's proof." I could see the panic starting to rise in her eyes. It was almost comical how quickly her tough girl act had vanished. But I wasn't about to stop now. No, this wasn't about making her feel bad. It was about showing her exactly who she was dealing with. She had to know that she couldn't just walk through life treating people like dirt without consequences. I glanced at the flight attendants, who were still standing at the front, keeping a respectful distance but watching the situation unfold. They had been silent witnesses to Karen's antics for the entire flight, and I could see that they were more than a little relieved that someone was finally taking charge. But it wasn't just the attendants who were watching now. Karen's scene had drawn the attention of a few passengers who had started murmuring to each other. Some of them were looking at Karen with disbelief, as if they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Others were looking at me with curiosity, likely wondering how I was going to finish this. I could almost feel the eyes of the whole plane on us as Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She opened her mouth, probably to say something else, but the words got stuck in her throat. She had nothing left to say. The mask was gone, and now all that was left was the reality of the situation. "I think you're finally getting it, Karen," I said, smiling just a little. "You've lost. You've made a fool of yourself, and now you're about to face the consequences." Her face twisted into something I couldn't quite describe, part embarrassment, part rage, and part pure terror. She opened her mouth again, but I could tell she was grasping for something, anything, that could save her from what was coming. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "This isn't fair. I'm a paying customer. I have rights." "Save it," I said, cutting her off once more. "You lost the right to make demands the moment you decided to treat everyone around you like garbage. You think money gives you the right to act however you want. Think again. It's people like you who ruin the experience for everyone else, and that's why you're going to get what's coming." For a moment there was complete silence. The plane had almost finished its descent, and the cabin was still, except for the sound of the air rushing outside the windows. Everyone was waiting for Karen's next move, but it was obvious that she didn't have one. She had run out of options. "Let me ask you something," I said, keeping my voice steady, now that I knew she had no more fight left in her. "What did you think was going to happen? You thought you could just walk all over everyone and not face the consequences. Did you really think no one would call you out on it?" Her eyes darted around, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew I was right. The plane hit the runway with a slight jolt, and the fasten seatbelt sign clicked off, signaling that we had officially landed. But for Karen, the real landing was just beginning. As the plane slowed to a taxi, I leaned back in my seat, finally feeling a sense of closure. As we came to a stop at the gate, the flight attendants began their final walk down the aisles, preparing to escort passengers off the plane. One of them approached Karen's seat, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, we need you to remain seated for a moment," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to have a word with you about your behavior." Karen's eyes widened and her hands trembled in her lap. She glanced at me, her gaze filled with panic now. She knew what was coming. She had no choice but to face the consequences of her actions. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice cracking. "This is outrageous. I demand to speak to the manager. This is a mistake." But it was too late. The flight attendants were already taking control of the situation, their tones serious and professional. They'd had enough of Karen's antics, and now it was time for her to deal with the fallout. The moment Karen stood up to gather her things, the other passengers around her started murmuring, some exchanging knowing looks. They had seen everything, and they all knew the truth. Karen wasn't going to get away with it. I stood up, stretching my legs as I prepared to leave the plane. As I walked past Karen's seat, I turned to her with one last remark. "You should have thought twice before messing with someone who actually has the power to do something about it," I said, my voice low but dripping with satisfaction. Her face turned red and she opened her mouth, likely to shout something back. But no words came. She was already defeated, and the flight attendants escorted her off the plane without further issue. As I walked down the jet bridge and out into the terminal, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. I hadn't let her walk all over me, and I had made sure she would never forget this lesson. Karen had learned the hard way that entitlement and arrogance only get you so far, and in the end, it's people like me who make sure justice is served. And that felt like the real victory. As I stepped off the plane and into the terminal, a deep sense of satisfaction washed over me. I wasn't just relieved the flight was over. I was proud of how I'd handled the situation. It wasn't about being confrontational or making a scene. No, it was about standing my ground, showing Karen that she couldn't treat people however she wanted, and that actions do have consequences. I pulled my bag off the overhead compartment and walked through the jet bridge, hearing the low hum of the terminal around me. People were busy, rushing to catch their connecting flights, chatting with their travel companions, or just staring down at their phones. But as I walked past them, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't just that Karen had been put in her place. It was that, for once, someone had stood up to her, someone had pushed back against the entitled behavior she thought she could get away with. It felt good to be that person. I made my way toward the baggage claim, trying to stay calm. I wasn't a huge fan of airports to begin with, too many people, too many moving parts, but today was different. As I glanced at the overhead signs directing passengers to their gates, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text from one of the flight attendants. "Hey, just wanted to thank you again for handling that situation with Karen. You kept everything from going off the rails, and honestly, the whole crew appreciates it. We've been dealing with her behavior for a while, and you put her in her place better than anyone could have. Have a good rest of your day." I smiled, feeling a little boost of pride. It wasn't often I received a message like that. People usually avoided confrontation when they could, especially when they didn't want to deal with someone like Karen. But me, I'd never been afraid to face it head-on. It wasn't in my nature. As I walked through the terminal, I spotted a coffee stand ahead. It wasn't the best coffee I'd ever had, but at that moment, it was exactly what I needed. I stood in line, my thoughts drifting back to the flight. How Karen had turned everything into a spectacle, how she had made everyone around her uncomfortable, but most importantly, how she had thought she was untouchable. It was funny, really. She was so used to people just letting her have her way because of who she thought she was. She probably never expected someone like me, a regular guy, to stand up to her. And the best part, she had no idea who I really was. She had no idea that I wasn't just a random guy in first class. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email. I opened it absent-mindedly while waiting for my coffee. It was from the airline's customer service department. I was a little confused at first, but as I read the email, I realized they were reaching out to thank me for my professionalism. "Dear Mr. My name. We want to take a moment to express our appreciation for how you handled the situation with another passenger on flight number. Your calm demeanor and ability to de-escalate the situation helped avoid further conflict and ensured the safety and comfort of everyone aboard. We've reviewed the incident and will be taking appropriate actions based on your report. Thank you for your assistance in maintaining the integrity of our service." I couldn't help but laugh a little under my breath. I wasn't expecting this at all. But then again, I wasn't really surprised. People like Karen often got away with their behavior because no one wanted to take a stand, but today I had, and the airline recognized it. I wasn't the type to look for attention or rewards, but this felt like validation. It wasn't just that I had gotten through the flight without anything major happening. It was that I had kept my cool, not just for my sake, but for everyone else's too. And in the end, I had done the right thing. The coffee machine beeped, signaling that my drink was ready. I grabbed it and took a sip, the warm liquid a welcome comfort. The bitterness of the coffee matched my thoughts. Karen hadn't learned anything. She had walked off that plane angry and defiant, probably still believing the world owed her something. But I had no doubt that she was going to remember the lesson I'd taught her for a long time. I took another sip of the coffee and let out a sigh. This was more than just about Karen. It was about all the times people like her, entitled, arrogant, rude, tried to make everyone else feel small. Today, I had made sure that someone had finally stood up to that behavior, and I had done it without raising my voice, without getting physical. I had done it with just the power of words and presence. I could already imagine what Karen would do next. She'd probably try to make a big complaint, hoping that her tantrum would get her something, a refund, an apology, some kind of compensation. But that was the beauty of it. The airline had already seen what had happened, and I had the backup I needed. She wasn't going to win this time. She was used to getting her way, and that's exactly why she'd fallen so hard today. I made my way out of the terminal and into the crowded arrivals area, my eyes scanning for my ride. The sun was just beginning to set outside, casting a soft, golden glow across the buildings. It was a beautiful evening, and I was grateful for the break from everything that had happened. But as I waited for my driver to arrive, I couldn't help but replay everything that had gone down. I'd done the right thing. Karen had overstepped, and she'd learned the hard way that people aren't afraid to stand up to that kind of behavior. The thing is, people like her think they can get away with it because they're loud, obnoxious, and full of hot air. But they forget one simple truth. They're not the only ones with a voice. They're not the only ones who can speak up when things aren't right. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to relax and enjoy the fact that Karen had been put in her place. There was a certain power in knowing that the bad guys don't always win. In the past, I'd watched people like her get away with things I could never understand. But today was different. Today, she had met someone who wasn't afraid to push back, to challenge her, to show her that her entitlement didn't mean a damn thing. I had no idea what would happen next. Maybe Karen would go on with her life, maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she'd think twice before making another scene in public. But regardless of how things unfolded, I knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't be the same after today. And that, I thought, was what made all of this worthwhile. I hadn't just shown her up. I had made sure she knew exactly what happens when you treat others like dirt. The car pulled up and I got in, the familiar sound of the engine starting up filling the silence. I leaned back in the seat and glanced out the window, the lights of the city blurring past as we drove. I didn't know what would come next in my life, but I felt different today. Stronger, more certain of who I was and what I stood for. I didn't need to be a superhero. I didn't need to have all the answers. All I needed to do was stand up for what was right, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it meant going against someone like Karen. And that, in the end, felt pretty damn good. As we drove through the streets, I couldn't help but smile to myself. No matter how big or small the victory, sometimes, justice is as simple as knowing when to speak up, and when to let someone else feel the weight of their own actions. And that, I realized, was all the revenge I needed.